Good to go. You can start now.
Okay. Hello, everyone out in cyberspace. Hopefully one of these days we will be liberated from Zoom. Nothing against Zoom. It's very convenient, but it'll be nice to see your smiling faces live again someday soon. So we're going to talk tonight about the 10 plagues. For better or worse, certainly the rabbis knew what they were doing when they came up with the text of the Haggadah that we say at the Seder. But the 10 plagues come and go awfully quickly. You know, we're dipping and we're singing and we're drinking and we're, Dayenu, and we're telling the story and we're asking questions and answering those questions. And we get to the 10 plagues and we quickly run through them. We dip for each one and dip, and we name them. And we have the interesting mnemonic, Tzach, Adash, Be'achav, which is the first letter of each of them. And that's the way we're supposed to remember them. And then we move on. But it's important to realize that, as we know, the 10 plagues were not just historic in terms of what they represented in the freedom of the Jews, the beginning of the process of freeing us, but they were very specifically calculated. Each one was meant to punish the Egyptians in a manner in which they had afflicted us, and each one was very specific. It wasn't God just randomly throwing out 10 different things and pounding them. They were for very specific reasons. So the commentators have gone through, there are commentators on this that talk about what the purpose was of each one of the plagues. I want to talk about something different, which is not as well known, and that is the pattern within the plagues, and then try to tease out a lesson from those patterns, and then talk about something else that's going on during the plagues. So 10 plagues, we have Dam, Tzifradeh, and Keenan, blood, frogs, and lice. We have Arov, Dever, and Shchin, wild animals, pestilence, and boils. And we have Barad, and we have hail, we have locusts, and we have darkness, Choshech, and then we have the 10th one, Makas Bechoros. Those 10 are actually 3 sets of 3. The first 9 are 3 sets of 3. With the 10 is the coup de grace, the Makkah B'Patish, the final act. So if you notice, if you look carefully, you'll see that there is a pattern within the first 9, 3 sets of 3 as follows. Before the first one in each set, God has Moses, deliver a warning. He tells Pharaoh what is about to happen, and he tells him why. So each one of those, before the first of the set of 3, there's a what and a why. Before the second of each set of 3, there's a what. God tells Moshe, go tell Pharaoh that the following thing is going to happen. So there's a warning, but there's no explanation. There's no why. It's just a what. And then before the last one of the 3, there's no warning whatsoever. It just happens. So again, you've got before number 1, 4, and 7. That's the first of each set of 3. So that's blood, wild animals, and the hail. You have God telling Moshe to tell Pharaoh, this is what is going to happen, and here's why. Before the second of each set of the 3, the second, the 5th, and the 8th, frogs, pestilence, and locusts, Moshe is told by God to tell Pharaoh what is going to happen. And then before the third of each 3, before the lice, before the boils, and before the darkness, they just happen. There's no warning. Before the 10th, there's also it repeats itself. It is the first on its own. And so there's a what and a why. So let's go through what each of the whys is before the first of each one of the 3. Before the first one, God tells Moshe to tell Pharaoh that there's going to be this plague of blood. Why? So that you will know that I am God. So this is Moshe talking to Pharaoh, quoting God, telling Pharaoh that there's a plague coming. The water's going to turn into blood. Why? So that you will know that I am God. Not that Moshe is God, that God is God. He's quoting Moshe. So this is, by way of maybe outrageous analogy, you'll forgive me, and I will try hard not to start singing the song. There's a famous song from the Rolling Stones. It's called Sympathy for the Devil. And the song begins with the devil introducing himself. He says, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. And the song goes on. It is a classic. Don't leave to go start listening to it. But it certainly is a classic in the history of rock and roll. So by, again, ridiculous analogy, and I hope God doesn't take issue with this or get upset at me. or I'll be in big trouble. Just trying to make the point. God is introducing himself to Paro. He's saying there's going to be this plague of blood so that you will know that I am God. Adonai, that's the word that God is using. Now, it fits perfectly because previously, when Moshe went to Paro for the first time and said, listen, God said that you should let his people go, Paro said back to Moshe, Pharaoh said to Moses, who is God that I should listen to his voice and let the Jews go? I don't know God, and I won't let the Jews go. So God is now introducing himself. Hey, how you doing? Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm God. That makes sense. Before the first plague, God's saying, it's coming. It's going to be blood. And you want to know the reason? So that you'll know that I'm God. Before the second, as we see, there is a warning. Moshe is told by God to tell Paro what's coming, frogs, but not why. And before the third one, it just happens. The lice just happen. Now we go to this next set of three. So God's going to tell Moshe to tell Paro what's going to happen and why. This time, the why is different. It's I'm going to bring wild animals. Why? So that you will know that I am God in the midst of the earth. So you see a progression here. The first one is just, hey, just want to introduce myself. I'm God. The second one is, oh, by the way, I'm God in the midst of the earth. Meaning, don't think that you have this different conception of God. You may think that, okay, so there's another God. I'm going to add this God to the pantheon of gods. But he's probably up there in heaven, not concerned down here. God's saying, no. I'm down here, the Kereva Aretz, in the midst of the earth. So realize, I want you to have a little insight as to who I am. I'm down here in the midst of the earth. And then we have the fifth plague. Moshe is told to come down and tell Paro it's going to be dever, it's going to be pestilence, not why. And then we have the sixth, boils. They just happen, no warning, because that's the third in the second set of three. So there's never a what or a why before the third. And then before the seventh, again, the seventh is the first of the next set of three. So we're going to have a what and a why. This time, the what is hail. The why is that Paro is told so that you will know there is none like me in all the earth. And he continues and he explains that he let Paro, he could have killed him, but he let him survive. Why? So that my name will be declared throughout all the earth. Now, this is obviously a much bigger deal because now it's not only my God, and not only am I down here, you may think, oh, okay, so he's down here. There are a couple other gods that are down here. I don't know which gods of Pharaoh's were down here. His invented gods, his god of the Nile and his sun god and his sheep god. God's saying there is no God. There's no entity like me. No one like me. And I want my name declared throughout all the earth. So it's moving. Each one is moving forward, teaching an additional lesson. Before the eighth plague, God does something differently. He's not giving a warning to Pharaoh because it's the second of the set of three. So there's no warning to Pharaoh. But God says to Moshe that I'm going to bring this one so that you'll know, the Jewish people will know, you'll relate to your sons so that you will know that I am God. This one's for us. So we get this insight, like in case we didn't realize, God's sort of hinting to Moshe, by the way, these plagues that I'm bringing, and of course they're carefully calibrated to exactly specifically punish the Egyptians for what they've done. And there are these lessons that I'm teaching Paro. But by the way, they're also for you guys. They're for the Jews, because I want you to know that I'm God. And then before the 10th one, this is now it's a first because we've already had the three sets of three. So now there's a new one coming, new sets. There's going to be a what and a why. And God, through Moshe, warns Pharaoh about the striking of the firstborn. And he says, so that you'll know that God distinguishes between the Egyptians and the Jews. Now that has got to really hit Pharaoh where he lives. That God distinguishes between the Egyptians and the Jews isn't just distinguish. He's playing favorites because he's been smiting, to use that old fancy word, the Egyptians. And here it's the king of the Egyptians being told, oh, by the way, God, very powerful, who's down here in the earth, and there's no one like him, and his name spread throughout the world. You better spread it out there. He distinguishes between the Egyptians and the Jews. Oh, and by the way, the Jews are his firstborn. He's taken out the Egyptian firstborn, choosing his Jewish firstborn to save, to protect, and to free. So what exactly is going on there? You have to wonder there. Is God suddenly acting like one of the villains in James Bond movie? Like he's suddenly telling, he's gloating to Pharaoh? Like, yeah, I'm God, I'm down here on the earth. There's nobody like me. And I like the Jews, not you, chump. Like he's at the end, like whenever Bond is caught and the villain is walking around and telling Bond about how his plans for world domination, how he's going to slowly but surely kill Bond, and of course he leaves and Bond gets free while the villain is away, like or in the old Batman serial when that would happen, they'd leave him off, then walk away, the Joker, the Riddler, whoever it was that had captured him. Like, is that what's going on? I doubt it. But let's compare the following. Earlier in the Torah, there's a very, very difficult scene, painful scene, a weird scene to understand. What happens is that Jacob, has taken the blessings that were meant for his brother Esau. His father Isaac, Yitzchak, had planned to give the blessings of physical prosperity to the older twin brother. And instead, at his mother's bidding, at Rivka's bidding, Jacob, has impersonated his brother, and he has intercepted the blessings. And now Esau has come back. He's realized what has gone on, what he would call Yaakov's treachery, what we would call Yaakov's important, critical, necessary preservation of the Jewish people. Because what's going on is that his father plans to give him the physical blessings so that he'll be successful and give a few dollars to the Jews so they can sit and learn Torah. And Esau is not planning to do that. And his mother realizes that. It's like an anticipatory breach of a contract, as a lawyer would say. So she realized we have no choice. You got to get those blessings. So Esau is so upset. And in a genuine moment, as difficult as he is and as implacable an enemy as he is, he's sincere. He's really upset that he didn't get his father's blessings. His father says, I don't have anything left for you. And he says, Dad, you don't have anything you can give me. His father says, okay. And he gives him this blessing, basically saying that your brother's going to rule over you, but there are times when you'll be able to push off his yoke. And the commentators explain that what that means is that when we stray, he's going to be able to pound us. Now, thank you very much, Isaac. Thank you, Yitzchak, our patriarch. Wonderful blessing. When we stray, Esau, Amalek, our enemies, get to pound us? Like, why'd you have to do that? I get it. He was sincere, and I get it. He was crying, and I get it. A father loves his son, but come on, just give him a blessing that you'll have a lot of Bitcoin. I don't know. Like, you're right. You won't have as much money. You won't have as much as you have. But just when we stray, he's going to pound us. But you have to wonder from that blessing what Yitzhak was doing. You have to wonder, and it's a painful question to ask. I'm just throwing it out for discussion. We can talk about this offline for those of you who want to reach out to me. Was Yitzchak looking into the future and realizing, I need a prod because I'm worried that if the host countries, when we eventually go into exile, are too nice to us and they're too welcoming, will there be Jews left? Do we need that prod of people starting up with us to stop assimilation? Is that what he was doing? Was he setting up a situation where there's going to be some persecution when we stray, and that's going to bring us back on path? Difficult, painful to suggest, but I don't think we should shy away from discussing that. Who knows? If there was never any persecution, and every time we were guests in a host country, we're accepted with welcome arms. You're great, you're successful, and you're smart, and you're funny, and you're inventive, and you're a credit to our society. We're welcoming you with open arms. Would it be assimilation rather than 20% or 50% or 85%? Would it be 100%? Would there still be Jews in the world? You have to wonder that. And so you have to wonder whether, when God is telling Paro that you'll know that God distinguishes between the Egyptians and the Jews, is that really a stage whisper to us? Is that what's going on? Remember before the eighth plague, when God had said to Moshe, so that you'll know, and so you'll relate to your children that I am God. And I wonder if this isn't similar to there's a story told about a young boy who was a member of a family, a well-known family that had been in the U.S. for generations and generations. I'm sure they're still around, and just with a great retention rate. Like each one just with the program. Nobody strayed from the Torah true path. And somebody once asked one of the kids, like, how do you do that? Like, how is it that you never have anybody, go off? And the kid said, who was at this time older, in his, 40s, 50s, he said, I'll tell you, the only thing I can remember is that when I was 8 years old or so, my father took me aside and he pointed to a non-Jewish kid across the street, and he said, just I want you to look at him, and I want you to know that we are different. Now that's a loaded term, and it's a specific term. He didn't say, I want you to look at that non-Jewish boy, and I want you to know that we are better. Different doesn't have to mean better. And this is something that we sometimes lose sight of. Oh, we're the chosen people, so we are therefore born better. I don't think we're supposed to look at ourselves like that. We're supposed to look at ourselves as being different. Chosen means chosen to represent something. And we're meant to represent God's presence in the world. That's what we're supposed to do. When God says, so that you'll relate to your children, so that you will know that I'm God, that's an important mandate. We're supposed to be the ones that are passing it on generation after generation, that God exists, and he's down here in the world, and there's no one like him, and we're modeling that behavior. That's what we're here for as the chosen people. We're not chosen, and therefore that makes us better. We're chosen, that makes us different, because we've got this mantle of leadership. And you see this also coming back to our story, that there are two more messages at the sea when the Jews are between the rock and the hard place, between what Homer would later say is Scylla and Charybdis, the rock and the hard place. They have the advancing Egyptian army behind them, and they've got the sea in front of them, and it's a fine mess they've gotten themselves into. And God splits the sea, and God tells them two more times. He says, so that the Egyptians will know that I am God. What do you mean the Egyptians will know that I'm God? You're splitting the sea, and then you're bringing it back in on the Egyptians and killing them so that they'll know that I'm God? Or again, is that meant as a stage whisper? It's meant for us, like, oh, right. It's not just that they'll know. It's that we'll know that we're different. And maybe that's what's going on. And it's interesting too, that before I leave this section of the talk, many years ago, the New York Times, I think it was the Times, it's probably the Times, did this article, scholarly, scientific article, just in time for Passover, explaining why each of the 10 plagues and the parting of the sea were not miracles. They are all explainable through scientific phenomena. And they went through in detailed fashion. They had a different scientist for each one, a different guest who was interviewed. I don't know if maybe it was one scientist that did more than one. I don't remember. And they went through how the blood could have been caused by this reaction in the water, and how the frogs could have been caused by this rare thing that can happen with frogs, and how the darkness could have been an eclipse, and how the firstborn, they could have died through this, and how the sea could have split through this different phenomenon in the sea. And they went through how they weren't miracles. This is a way, it's a natural phenomena after natural phenomena, missing the point that that's possible. Maybe God used these natural phenomena in order to make these miracles, but the miracle could have been in the timing. Think about the last one, right? The Jews are at the edge of the sea, and the Egyptian army is about to catch up to them. And right then, there's this natural phenomenon, and the sea splits, and the Jews start walking through it. Oh, wait, it gets better. The natural phenomenon ends, and the sea collapses back on itself. When the last Jew makes it to dry land, and the entire Egyptian army is in the sea. Suddenly, the waters come back, and they drown the Egyptians. Wow, how about that timing? What an interesting coincidence that natural phenomenon occurred right exactly then, right when the Jews were had no hope, boxed in, and it ended right when the last one got out, when the entire Egyptian army is inside. The miracle can be in the timing. But that miracle, all those miracles, of course, they were meant to teach Paro, to teach Pharaoh that lesson, but they were also certainly meant to teach us all of those lessons. Sometimes God will do something, and it's you look carefully. I'm whispering to you, I'm doing this, but it's really for you. And so now I want to transition and go back into the plagues and point out to you something that is absolutely stunning. I noticed this a number of years ago, and when I first noticed it, it was I went through and realized these patterns. I realized how incomprehensible it is, because we went through these exact specific patterns. God is telling Moshe exactly when to speak and exactly what to say. He is scripting this for him. I want you to warn him before the first two of every three. I want you to give an explanation before the first one of every three. Over the second, just a warning, no explanation. Before the third of each three, not a word, nada. Each time, it's an exact pattern, and the wise are also very specific. It's not the same one each time. It's so that you'll know I'm God. First of, it's so that you know I'm God here in the middle of the earth. It's so that you'll know that there's no one like me. So wouldn't you know that after some of the plagues, some of them really get to Paro, not all of them. And after some of them, he calls Moshe back to the palace. He summons him back to the palace, and he asks him to stop. That's it. You have to stop these plagues. So the first time that he does this is after the second plague. And Moshe says to Paro, okay, when do you want me to make it stop? Possibly the most ridiculous question in history. Let's see, Mo. When do I want it to stop? Why don't you make it stop next Tuesday? Like, what are you talking? Make it stop right now. I summoned you into the palace because I cannot handle any more rivets. I got frogs coming out of my head. Make it stop. And Paro answers Moshe with an answer that's even more ridiculous than the question. Moshe said, when would you like to stop? And the answer obviously is going to be right now. And Paro says, tomorrow. What do you mean tomorrow? You called the guy in because it's driving you crazy. You want him to stop the plague. What do you mean tomorrow? So what's going on is that as follows, is that Paro is thinking, oh, I get it. This magician, he knows it's about to stop. So he's asking me, when would you like it to stop? Because he knows I'm going to say right now, and it's going to stop. I'm going to trick him. I'm going to say tomorrow. And so what happens after that is you'll see fascinatingly is that as the plagues continue, God starts telling Moshe to say to Paro, starting now, oh, by the way, this is what's going to happen tomorrow, like right back at you, buddy. Okay, so that I get. But here's what took me a long time to try to figure out. I want to suggest an explanation in a few minutes for this, is that when Moshe answers Paro, and he says, okay, as you wish, it'll be tomorrow. He says, fine, it's going to stop tomorrow so that you will know that there's none like God. What is going on? What is Moshe coming up with another explanation that God, as far as we can tell, did not tell him? Now, the easy answer would be, yes, God must have told him off screen. Oh, by the way, he's going to summon you, or if he summons you, this is what you should tell him. But we don't get that. And you'd think that we would get that because you see God being so careful each time to tell Moshe what to tell Paro. Why didn't we hear about this before? It seems like Moshe's freelancing. Not only that, but take a look at what this message is. It's after number 2, so that you will know that there's none like God. That is almost verbatim the message that God gives before number 7, so that you will know that there's none like me in all the earth. It's almost like Moshe figures or is assuming that that's the ultimate message. So it's like he's advancing it forward. Moshe, what's going on? God, if God didn't tell you to say that, he told you up to now, it's just so that you'll know that I'm God. We didn't even get to so that I'm God down here in the earth, let alone there's no one like me. So Moshe seems to be jumping the gun and advancing along this later message at an earlier time without having been told to do so by God. And then again, after number 7, Moshe gets called into the palace and asked to stop it. And Moshe says he's going to do that. Why? So that you will know that the earth belongs to God. That's even stronger than God's later message. It's almost like saying resistance is futile. Give it up. You have no chance. The entire earth belongs to God. So what is going on? This now sounds again like Moshe is freelancing. This one's a different message. It's different than any of the messages that God gave. It arguably is even stronger, like a way to try to convince Paro to surrender and surrender right now, surrender early, don't keep this up. What's going on? How could he possibly be freelancing, particularly when God has been so careful to script exactly what he should say and when he should say it? So if you take a look, you see that earlier we were told that the king of Egypt died. This is when Moshe was a fugitive. Let's go back and remember that Moshe had been in Egypt earlier in his life and was the overseer in the palace and saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jew. And he looked this way and that, saw that there was no man there, which according to the commentators means he looked this way and that. Not that he was looking for witnesses. He looked this way and that and saw there was no man there, meaning he didn't see a man where he was. He's like, what am I? Am I an Egyptian or am I a Jew? I got to make a decision. And he decided, even though I'm the overseer of the palace, I'm a Jew. He knew about his heritage. He knew where he came from. And so he decided that I'm a Jew, and he stepped in and he killed the Egyptian and buried the body. And then word got back to Pharaoh, and he had to flee. And we're told that while he's in Midian as a fugitive, before he comes back, that the king of Egypt died. Okay, the king of Egypt died. But there's actually a debate. The commentators explain that according to one opinion, he did not die. It's the same king. What happened? He got saras. He got what's often misinterpreted as or mistranslated as leprosy. It's not leprosy, but it's some divine punishment that people used to get. We don't have it anymore. And they got saras, so he was considered as if he was dead. So according to that commentator, this is not a new king. It's the same king, which means that Moshe is going back to the palace where he was raised as a kid. And he's going back to the palace to confront his foster father. This is not somebody that he doesn't know. This is the guy who brought him up, or at least allowed him to be brought up in his house. Because remember what had happened. He was a baby and was in the Nile. He was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, and she brought him back to the palace. And that's where he brought up. That's where he was brought up. So perhaps Moshe is confronting his foster father. Or maybe the king of Egypt had died. If the king of Egypt had died, the most likely person who had succeeded him would have been his son. And maybe his son was a decent guy. We don't know. In fact, we know that Pharaoh's daughter was a decent girl. She's the one who saved Moshe. So is it crazy to think that maybe her brother, who would have been Moshe's, whatever you want to call him, foster brother, after he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, maybe he was a decent guy. And maybe, I have to give some credit, maybe Spielberg was right. Spielberg in his animation, Prince of Egypt, about this story, has scenes where Moshe is, as a youngster, buddies with Pharaoh's son, who later grows up to become the ruler, to become Pharaoh. So maybe when Moshe goes back, he's confronting his foster brother. Again, somebody that he knew really well and somebody with whom he may have been close growing up. Maybe even closer than with his brother Aaron, because he had very, very little time spent with his brother Aaron, his brother Aaron, because he was sent back home to be nursed by his mother. How long did his mother nurse him? And at a very young age, he was sent back to the palace. And so he may have had a much closer relationship or much more familiarity with that foster brother than he did with his own blood brother, with Aaron. And so it could very well be that when Moshe is going back to the palace, he's confronting either his foster father or his foster brother. Now think about this. When he leaves the palace for the last time, we're told that he leaves in great anger. Why? Makes absolute sense. Because he has been pleading and pleading and pleading with Pharaoh, whether it's foster father, foster brother, pleading with him, whoever he is, let my people go. And it's no, 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 and no. And finally, Pharaoh sends him out of the palace, and he's in a rage. Oh, is he angry? So it makes sense. He's angry because he just will not let the people go. Rashi, greatest of the biblical commentators, says something stunning. He says, you know why Moshe was so angry? Because Paro had said to him, get out of the palace. You'll never see my face again. What? So that's why he's upset? Can you imagine you were the delegate to go meet with one of the great enemies of the Jews? I don't even like to say that Haman or Hitler, wipe out his name, or one of our other great enemies. And that enemy said, one of the rulers in Iran says to you, get out of here. You'll never see my face again. Like, my reaction is like, dude, I don't ever want to see you. I didn't want to see your ugly mug in the first place. You think I'm upset that I'm not going to see your face again? You got it all wrong, pal. See ya. C'est la vie. I'm not enjoying this. So what is Rashi talking about? He's angry because Paro said, you'll never see my face again? So maybe, if it's his foster father or foster brother throwing him out, remember, God knows what he's doing. When God chose Moshe, he chose the one Jew that wasn't just familiar with the palace. He was familiar with all of Roger's rules of parliamentary procedure. He's familiar with every nook and cranny of that palace. He used to be the overseer of the palace, and he had a prior relationship with Paro, either his foster father or his foster brother. So I don't want to say that I don't think it's appropriate to say that Moshe was angry because of psychologically it was his foster father or brother saying, "You'll never see my face again." I don't want to say that, but I do want to say this. Maybe he feigned the anger. Maybe he was showing anger to try its one last ditch effort to try to convince this Pharaoh, save yourself before it's too late. Okay, let's consider his prior tests. Let's go back, right? His first test was, there's an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jew. I'm not going to get involved. I can just sit back and I didn't see it, look the other way, go back into the palace. Because if I get involved, this could be the end of my career in the palace. I may have to flee, which is what ends up happening. Yes, I'm going to get involved. He kills the Egyptian. His next test is when it's Jew versus Jew. It's got two Jews fighting. Do I really want to stick my neck into that? Yes, I do. They're fighting, and I got to get involved in that. His next test is when he has to flee for his life as a fugitive after, unfortunately, one of the Jews tells on him, and Pharaoh's looking to kill him, and he flees from the executioner, and he makes it to Midian as a fugitive. So as soon as he gets to Midian, what's going on? You've got a fight between non-Jew versus non-Jew, because the Midianite shepherds are harassing the daughters of the priest, the high priest of Midian, or maybe the deposed high priest of Midian, depending on the medrash, of Yisro's daughters, and he gets involved, and he shoos away the shepherds, and he frees up the girls so that they can go and get water. His next test, after he marries one of Yisro's daughters, and he becomes the shepherd for Yisro, is that he takes, we're told specifically, the passage tells us that he takes Yisro's shepherds way out in the hinterland to graze. Why? Because he's worried that those sheep might eat the nibble on the grass of someone else. So now it's a test of, are you going to be careful about the property of others, property of non-Jews? Yes, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to take those sheep away so they don't steal from the property of others. And then the next test is when one of the animals gets sick, one of the sheep gets sick, and he's kind of struggling. He's straggling the back. And he's not keeping up with the rest of the flock. And Moshe goes over to that sheep. He says, "What's wrong?" And he sees it's sick. And he picks up that sheep and he puts it over his shoulders and he's carrying it back. And that's when up in heaven, God says, "That's the guy. That's the guy that I want to lead my flock. That guy who has shown the sensitivity to get involved when it was Egyptian versus Jew, Jew versus Jew, non-Jew versus Jew, the property of a non-Jew. Now it's an animal and he's getting involved. With all those tests, that's the guy I want to lead my flock." And so that's when God appears in the burning bush. Now, I'd like to think that we would have done the same thing. I worry whether we would have, because there's a bush on fire and Moshe's walking past. And if it were us back then or now, we might say, I see peripherally out of the corner of my eye, there's a bush that's on fire and it's not being consumed. Now that's a little scary, because that could mean that God is in that bush. And if God's in that bush, he might start asking me to do things. So you know what? Maybe I didn't see anything, and maybe I should keep waltzing and whistling along my merry way. And instead, Moshe turns and he says, the bush is not being consumed. I have to go and investigate. I have to go see what that is. And so I'm wondering, is this another test? Remember the following. Moshe was not allowed to hit the water before the first and the second plague. First and second plague required hitting the water. And Moshe was not allowed to hit the water. Why? Because the water had saved him. When he was a baby, when his mother placed him in a little basket, that water, the Nile, had saved him. Not allowed to strike the water. He has a debt of hakaras hatov. He's a debt of gratitude. So he can't hit the water. Third plague, he's not allowed to hit the ground. Why can't he hit the ground? Because the ground had saved him. Not for a long period of time. What happened? He had buried the Egyptian in the ground. So for the short period of time, in between the time when he buried him and when word got back to Pharaoh, the ground had saved him for that temporary period of time. Hey, but that's enough. Even if it was a short period of time, the ground had temporarily saved him. He owes a debt of gratitude to the ground. So therefore, he cannot hit the ground. So it's interesting also that God had told Moshe to be respectful to Paro when he went back to Egypt. He had said to him very specifically, I don't want you to embarrass him. You would think, wait, come on. This guy's torturing, tormenting the Jews. It's time. Let's go. We're getting out of here. Whatever you got to do. Of course, you got to heap it on. He said, no, I want you to be respectful to him. Now, some say the reason, this is wild, is that if Moshe had embarrassed Paro, that would have been the full punishment. And it would have just been that the embarrassment would have been so great in his position that God wouldn't have been able to bring plagues, because that would have been overdoing it. And so there's a story told, a wild story. I don't know where this is. I've heard different versions of this, of people who are in a bomb shelter, And there was a woman in the bomb shelter who was very difficult, like really difficult, like really, really, really difficult, non-stop heaping invective and abuse and insult on the other people in the shelter. And they found that it was intolerable. And so they went to a rabbi who was also in the shelter and they said, listen, we can't take it anymore. We have to send her out. I mean, it's going to be obviously very, very dangerous for her, but we can't live like this. The rabbi said to them, what are you talking about? She's the one saving you. They said, what do you mean that she's the one? What do you mean she's the one saving us? How is it possible that she's the one saving us? And so the rabbi explained that what's going on is that you're being embarrassed by her, and that embarrassment may well be what's saving us in the bomb shelter from the bombs, not just the shelter. So she's our security blanket. Don't send her out. And so that's why God maybe had said you can't embarrass Paro. And also you have to wonder, is this in consonance with the same reason that he couldn't hit the water and he couldn't hit the ground? He can't embarrass Paro because he owes a debt of gratitude. This is the dude that either raised him, if he's his foster father, or befriended him, if it's his foster brother. And so maybe similarly, he's got to be respectful and he has to be careful. And so maybe what's going on when he's giving these extra reasons, these extra warnings, the after number 2, where he says, so that you'll know that there's no one like God. And after number 7, so he says, you'll know that the earth belongs to God. Maybe he's trying to repay that debt of gratitude by trying to convince Paro, this is it. You can't, you got to give in. I owe you a debt of gratitude, and I'm trying to explain to you that resistance is futile, and you're a firstborn. You have a firstborn son. You're going to die. He's going to die. I'm trying to make it up to you what you did for me, so I'm doing everything that I can. And so maybe that can explain the following. There is a medrash. Now realize, I will tell you what this medrash is, but I will introduce it by explaining that the rabbis say that if you take every medrash literally, you're a fool. They're not all meant to be taken literally. But if you take none of them literally, then you're a heretic. You're an apikoros. Just got to be somewhere in between. Can't take them all literally. You can't take none of them literally. So there's a medrash, and I don't think it matters how literally we are meant to take this, because if it's actually happened or if something like it happened, it's mind-blowing given where we're up to right now and explaining Moshe's being told he couldn't hit the water, couldn't hit the ground. God telling him you got to be respectful of Paro. The medrash says that the last thing Moshe did before he left the palace in a burning anger, which maybe was real, maybe was feigned. Also, if it was feigned for the same reason, to try to show Paro, this is how serious I am. You got to give in. I'm trying to save your life here. The last thing he did, according to the medrash, was he slapped Paro across the face, slapped him upside the head before he left for the final time. How in the world was he allowed to do that? How could he slap Paro? Couldn't hit the water, couldn't hit the ground. The water and the ground are inanimate. Not only are they inanimate, but they're probably saying, hit me. What, are you kidding me? I'm the Nile. I get to be part of the 10 plagues on the ground. Let's go. Hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me. I'm playing blackjack here. Hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me. They want to be hit. Can't hit them. Because even if they want to be hit, just the raising your hand to strike an object, something that helped you out, can't do it. So here he's taking his hand and he's slapping his old foster father, foster brother across the face when God said you have to be respectful. So maybe it's one of two things. Maybe it's his last ditch effort to try to convince that person to whom perhaps he feels there might be some debt of gratitude, to try to save that person's life, save Paro's life. Or maybe that slap, because of the embarrassment. How can you even imagine the level of embarrassment? Pharaoh, the effectively the ruler of the world, getting slapped across the face. That slap may have saved his life. Meaning that now that he's leaving and he's seen he has not been able to convince him. He's given him these extra warnings and it still didn't work. And he's feigning this burning anger, but it's not working. And maybe by slapping him and embarrassing him, like we said before, had he embarrassed Paro, by the way he spoke to him, that might have been the full punishment, such that God, I can't pile on anymore. Like that is the full punishment. So maybe the embarrassment of the slap ends up saving Paro's life, because we're told that in Egypt, from the firstborn, that there was no one left. Ad echad, not a single one remained, which the commentators tell us can be read as aid echad, one witness, and which was Paro. And Paro, even though he was a firstborn son, ended up surviving. He survived the 10 plagues. He survived the sea, even though he was the first one. He was leading the charge in his chariot, but somehow he survived. The Medrash tells us that not only did he survive, but he went on to a successful career as the king of Nineveh. He's the king that when Jonah gets spit out of the big fish, and he eventually makes it to Nineveh and tells him to repent. The king of Nineveh says, all right, guys, let's go. We're going to repent. Because why? He's Paro. He's not starting up with God again. And so it could well be that Moshe actually ended up saving Paro's life, maybe through that slap. And so you have to wonder in This Week in Debate, and I've spoken about this before, and I've gotten some very spicy reactions, and that's fine. I just think it's worth the debate. Does a debt of gratitude disappear if the grantor is wicked? If an unbelievably wicked, remember who Paro was. I don't mean to take a thing away from his evil when I suggested, it was Moshe's foster father, Moshe's foster brother, not such a bad guy. How bad a guy could he have been? Maybe he was younger. He was a good guy. Guy was a monster. He was a monster. He was the guy who ordered the Jewish babies killed, thrown in the Nile. A monster 100 times over. But if Moshe had a debt of gratitude to him, which he presumably would have had because he was brought up in the palace, does that debt of gratitude get canceled out? Is it, wait 1 second, I have a personal debt of gratitude, but you're a monster, so now I'm free? I don't know. And it may well be that we might be seeing here that Moshe may feel that to the extent there is still a debt of gratitude, or even if there isn't one halachically, but if he feels one, like wait, come on, man, I raised you, or I was your buddy. How could you do this to me? Right? Then maybe Moshe feels that if he feels that way, even if it's his feeling and he's wrong, I have to be careful about that. There's another example of this, by the way, that as follows. After Sarah, the matriarch, dies, her son Yitzchak, Isaac, goes and brings Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, back to Avraham to remarry her. Now remember what had happened. Avraham had cast Hagar out of the house along with her son, Yishmael, Avraham and Hagar's son. Why? Because Sarah had told him to. So the reason, one of the commentators says, why Yitzchak went back to bring Hagar back to remarry Abraham is that Yitzchak was worried that Hagar still had a kapeda. She still had a claim, a taina. She still was upset at the fact that Sarah had insulted her. Now, Sarah had already died. So Yitzchak's still worried about Sarah, his mother's soul up in heaven. That's number one. Number two, think about that story. Avram did not want to send Hagar and Yishmael out. Sarah had said, you got to send them out. Avraham, the paragon of chesed, did not want to send them out. God himself said, listen to your wife. So here we have Yitzchak showing us that even if God said, you're right, we know Sarah was right. God said, listen to your wife. If someone else is upset, and they may have no right to be upset. Remember, it's God said she was right. But if someone else is upset, you got to go and try to appease them. So maybe even if halachically the actual debt of gratitude dissolves based on the wickedness of the grantor, but if the grantor feels, hey, you still owe me a debt of gratitude, maybe that's still an issue. It's something to think about. And it's also worth considering that the lesson for us, if there is, if my suggestion, my hypothesis is right, that a debt of gratitude still may exist, even if the grantor is a monster, then how much more so? How obvious, what an unbelievable lesson, how obvious it is, how we have to have a hakaras hatov, how we have to have a hakaras hatov gratitude to our parents who birthed and raised us, to anyone who has helped us. We see this, it's interesting. When God tells Moshe at the bush, after a week of arguing, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, it took a week. It was not clear from the passages, but the sages tell us there was a week. Moshe says, I don't speak that well. I'll send Aaron to be your spokesperson. They're not going to believe me. I'll give you signs. Finally, he says, send whom you'll send, which the commentators explains means send Aaron. I don't want to usurp him. He's the leader now, and I'm not going to do that. It's going to embarrass him. No, Aaron's coming to you. He's coming to greet you, and he's happy. You got to go. Okay? You're going to go. He goes to Yisro to ask permission to go. We need to ask permission to go. Just go to Yisro and say, listen, father-in-law, I love you very much. And I'm so thankful for everything you've done for me, for giving me your daughter and for housing me and my children. It's been unbelievable. But God himself has just appeared to me in a burning bush. And he's told me that it's time. He's tabbing me as the leader to go back to Egypt to take my people out, to save them. So I just wanted to bid adieu. I just wanted to give you a big hug and say goodbye and say thank you. So now what he does, he asks Yisro, his father-in-law, for permission to leave. What if Yisro says no? What if Yisro says, actually, it's I really like having you around, and I was in Egypt previously. I think the Jews can last give me another 6 months. I mean, come on, you got to give me more notice. I mean, any job, people give 2 weeks notice. What are you leaving now? You got to hang out here a little while longer. What would have happened? So I don't know what would have happened, but I do know that Moshe felt that it was obvious. He doesn't say to God, at least there's no record of Moshe saying to God, okay, listen, I'm going to do this. You've satisfied, you've answered all my questions. I just need permission first. Let me just make sure that I have permission from Yisro. So Moshe was obvious that I owe such a debt of gratitude to Yisro that even though there's a possibility of delaying the redemption, that debt of gratitude is so obvious that it needs to be repaid that God, he doesn't even have to tell me. He understands this. I have to ask him for permission. That is built in. It's, I want you to do this, but of course you have to ask permission from Yisro because you have a debt of gratitude. What a lesson for us. And it's interesting also, this fits because the entire book of Shemos, the second book, that has the Passover story, the Exodus story, the story of our redemption, starts off with a passage telling us that there was a king and the king did not know Joseph, didn't know Yosef. Like, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, how can the king of Egypt, how can the king of Egypt now not know who Yosef was? I mean, come on, we've all seen or heard about the play or read the story. But back then, so soon after what Yosef had done for that country, and the king didn't know him, I mean, he didn't know him. Of course, he knew who Yosef was. What it meant is that he was refusing to recognize any debt of gratitude to Yosef and to his people, to the Jewish people, which means that the book starts off with an example of a kafoi tov. That's somebody who rejects, denies the good that was done for him, denies a debt of gratitude. And that's why the whole rest of the book is filled. We don't have time to go through it, a topic for another class, but the entire rest of that book is filled with example after example after example of gratitude, hakaras tov, and the need to show it. And Passover, Pesach, is the perfect holiday because that's the holiday we get to recognize our incalculable debt of freedom from slavery and freedom to serve God. And the two go hand in hand. I talk about this all the time. It pains me tremendously that you can talk to such an incredibly high percentage of our Jewish brethren, brothers and sisters, and ask what they're planning for Passover. Religious, not religious, Passover. Going to a Seder, I'm getting some matzah, 4 cups, getting some wine. And then if you ask somebody, you ask the same person, what are you doing for Shavuos? And they say, what's that? I remember I was in front of a judge a number of years ago, and he said, okay, we're picking a trial date. Took out my old BlackBerry, a calendar on there. I said, okay, Your Honor, what date? He says a date. I said, oh, I can't do that. It's a Jewish holiday. And he says to me, listen, Mr. Rothenberg, I'm not Jewish, but I've been on the bench for 30 years in New York. So I know there's Passover in the spring, and there's the high holidays in the fall. There's nothing in between. I mean, what are you talking about? I said, Your Honor, it's Shavuos. He said, what's that? I said, well, how the Jews, they were in Egypt, and then God made all the plagues, and they crossed the sea, and they were freed. And then 50 days later, Moses went up on the mountain. Remember, he hit the tablets, and he brought them. And he said, well, they got the Torah. And he says, like, I said, there's a holiday representing when he first went up on the mountain at the beginning, and they heard God's voice and received the Torah. There's a holiday representing that. He said, I never heard of it before. Now, why is it that he heard of Passover and heard of the high holidays? And the answer is that most Jews, religious, not religious, Jewish, alienated, whatever stripe, they're celebrating Passover and the high holidays, but not Shavuos. We don't know about Shavuos. And that's a shame. And the reason maybe is that Passover is like you open up an envelope, you weren't expecting it. You're like, oh, what's in this envelope? It's like, oh, I got a check. I don't know. You got some unexpected check from somewhere, a refund or something. It's very exciting. You open up another envelope, it's like, oh, great, it's a bill. So Passover is like getting a check. We're free. Let's have a Seder. Let's eat. Shavuos is like the bill comes. Oh, by the way, there's 613 commandments. I'm not so into that holiday, but we have to be. In other words, you have to be celebrating those twin things. We're freed from slavery, but we're simultaneously freed to serve God. And I'll give you one last example of this, one of the many examples from the book of Shemos. At the end, we just finished the book last week. we're told at the very last section, very last parsha in Pikude, where there's a listing of the total amount of all of the donations to the Mishkan, all of the donations to the tabernacle. And all of the voluntary donations are listed, as well they should be, right? And we know that. Like if you go into a synagogue, right, and there's a listing that says there's a building campaign, all the donations are often listed. They're published. I mean, some people say, oh, it's unseemly. You're showing what people gave. And the people who are doing the fundraising campaign say, yeah, if we didn't, we'd collect less money. We have to show what people gave because that motivates people to give more money. And so they're listed and everybody's thanked. Big donations, small donations, often lists are published, other campaigns, etc. But it's not common, or at least I hope it's not common, because it could be awfully embarrassing to publish the lists of people who paid the synagogue dues. We're publishing a list, like that's mandatory. If you're a member, you got to pay the dues. You're going to shame somebody who wasn't able to pay the dues or forgot to pay the dues. That's not something we typically will list. We don't list the mandatory checks that come in. In Pekude, in that parsha, all of the donations are listed. The voluntary donations, I get that, and the mandatory donations, the ones they had to give. There was a certain amount that every single person had to give. There were others that God said, whatever your heart impels you to give, you should give, and I'm going to list it, and I'm going to thank you. Oh, and by the way, there's some other amount. Everybody's got to give, and God lists them to show us you've got to thank someone even if they had to do something for you. It was their obligation. It was their job. So what? It was their job. You got to thank them. You got to show that gratitude. And so we see, just to sum up, we see this fascinating pattern within the plagues where God is carefully calibrating it, not just to punish, but to send a message to the Egyptians, and in so doing, to send a message to us. And then you've got this fascinating, possible, seemingly, I don't want to say possible, I think it's probable, maybe you could argue, but at least in the text, it sure looks like Moshe is freelancing and giving these additional warnings to Paro. That's in the text, that's for sure. He gave those warnings. We do not see that God told him what to say. And they're different from the ones that God told him to say at different times, maybe advancing them. Maybe he's trying to convince Paro to give in. We see him getting angry for reasons that doesn't seem to make sense, because Paro said, you're not going to see my face again. Maybe he's feigning anger. And the Medrash is telling us that he slapped Paro across the face, which is so difficult to understand, that the same guy who couldn't hit the water and couldn't hit the ground was able to slap his foster father or brother across the face. And maybe all of that was that Moshe was trying hard, to the extent that either there was, or maybe Paro felt or would have argued that there was a debt of gratitude, that he's trying to repay that. And maybe that slap alone, because of that embarrassment, is what freed Paro. And I'm realizing, I hadn't planned to mention this, but I think I still have a minute or so, and so I will. Think about that for a second. That a slap maybe saved his life. And think about the fact that God told Moshe, be nice to him, because if you embarrass him, like, I'm not going to be able to bring the 10th place. That's going to be the full punishment. We have to think about that both ways. In other words, you have to realize just how devastating it is when you embarrass somebody. That's one of the biggest no-nos there is don't embarrass. I say this all the time to people. When you're on a group WhatsApp chat, you're on a group email, you gotta restrain yourself. Somebody says something a little saucy or spicy to you, you gotta respond. Just take the extra second, hold on the message. You'll have an optional WhatsApp, reply privately. Obviously, an email, you don't have to reply all. You can reply to that person. You said something. I was very insulted. I really think you should apologize. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. Say it privately rather than publicly blasting them. You'll say, they did it to me publicly. Yeah, great. So now you're embarrassing them publicly and you're taking revenge. It's a double no-no. And so we've got to be so careful about embarrassing someone else. And from our side, we have to remember that when you're embarrassed, instead of spending that time just hating on and staying up late at night thinking about ways you're going to get back at that person or what you like done to them, is instead saying that I'm not only going to forgive them, because that's very important, because now when you get to Yom Kippur, you can tell God, you know how upset that I was at that person, but I forgave them. Now I want you to forgive me. But just as importantly, you realize that maybe they shouldn't have done it. I'll have to work through my feelings about that. I have to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I have to forgive them. But at the end of the day, I was embarrassed. And that wouldn't happen if God didn't want it to happen. And so what I want that to do is I want that to count to the extent that I was supposed, that I did something wrong. And heaven was giving me a potch, giving me some kind of a consequence. I want that to count because that can count worse than any type of physical or financial injury. There are few things more painful than embarrassment. So if you've suffered through that, instead of hating on and thinking of ways to take revenge, forgive that person. That'll give you incredible amounts of power in your prayers throughout the year and on Yom Kippur. And say to God, let this count, because nothing makes up and atones for sins better than embarrassment. And so think that through. And so thank you again for listening. And everybody should have a happy and healthy Pesach, a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, a Zis and Pesach. And as I said, hopefully someday soon, we'll be able to see each other live in the coming weeks, months, etc. Be well. Thanks for tuning in.